Technology was supposed to get cheaper, faster, and more accessible over time. Stay with me, because something about that promise is quietly breaking. Your phone costs more, your subscriptions multiply, and upgrades feel unavoidable. Yet the narrative still says technology is becoming more efficient every year. So why does it feel like you are paying more, not less? That tension is not in your head, it is built into the system. Because technological progress and consumer cost do not always move together. In fact, they can move in completely opposite directions. The first layer is what most people were taught to expect. Better technology should reduce production costs over time, and lower costs should lead to cheaper products for consumers. That was true for decades, especially during early computing eras. But something changed in how technology is built and delivered. The cost is no longer just in the device you buy. It is in the ecosystem you are continuously paying to access. Hardware became a gateway, not the final product. And once you enter that gateway, the costs start compounding. Subscriptions, cloud storage, software licenses, and services follow. Each one feels small, but together, they redefine total cost. So the question is no longer what a device costs. It is what it costs to keep using it over time. Now here is where the contradiction becomes clearer. Technology companies optimize for recurring revenue, not one-time sales. Because predictable income is more valuable than occasional purchases. So pricing models evolve toward continuous extraction instead of single transactions. This shifts the burden from product cost to usage cost. And usage is where most people lose track of spending, because it feels like maintenance, not consumption. Now add another layer that makes this even more complex. The cost of building advanced technology is rising, not falling. Semiconductors, AI infrastructure, and data centers require massive investment. Each new generation becomes more expensive to develop and scale, so companies need to recover those costs somehow. And that recovery often comes from the user over time. Not all at once, but gradually, almost invisibly. This is why technology feels affordable at entry, but expensive to maintain over the long term. And that is where the perception begins to shift, because what looks cheaper up front becomes more expensive overall. Psychologically, this matters more than it seems. People evaluate cost at the moment of purchase, not over time. So systems are designed to minimize that initial resistance and maximize long-term engagement and spending afterward. If this is starting to feel familiar, stay with this, because the next layer explains why this trend is accelerating, not slowing down, even as technology keeps improving. And that is where the system becomes more structural than optional, because once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere, not just in devices, but across the entire digital economy. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than technology. The second layer begins where most people stop looking, because the cost of technology is no longer just about products. It is about infrastructure that users never directly see. Data centers, AI models, and cloud networks operate behind every interaction, and maintaining them requires continuous, large-scale investment. Unlike older systems, these costs do not stabilize easily over time. They expand as demand and complexity increase together, so efficiency gains are offset by rising expectations. Fast something becomes baseline, it is no longer optional. Now companies cannot scale down, they can only scale up, which locks them into higher cost structures permanently. And those costs eventually flow downstream to users, not as one large charge, but as many small, recurring ones. This creates the illusion that technology is still affordable, even as the total cost continues to rise. Now add competition into this system. Companies are not just competing on price anymore. They are competing on ecosystem lock-in and user retention. which means keeping you inside their environment as long as possible. Switching costs are designed to feel inconvenient or costly. So once you enter, leaving becomes harder over time. This changes how pricing power works, because locked-in users are less sensitive to gradual increases. And gradual increases rarely trigger strong reactions. Now combine this with another shift that feels subtle. Ownership is being replaced by access across most technology. You no longer own software. You subscribe to it. You do not store data locally. You rent space in the cloud. Even hardware is increasingly tied to services for full functionality. So the value shifts from possession to permission, and permission requires continuous payment to maintain. This is not necessarily negative, but it is structurally different, because it removes the endpoint where costs stop. Now cost becomes a timeline instead of a transaction, and timelines are harder for people to evaluate clearly. So the system benefits from that lack of clarity. Now here is the behavioral layer underneath all of this. People adapt quickly to new technological standards. What once felt advanced soon feels necessary, and what feels necessary becomes difficult to remove. So spending increases without feeling like a conscious choice. It feels like maintaining normal life. And that is where the system becomes most effective, because it blends cost into daily routine invisibly. If this is starting to feel uncomfortable, stay with it, because the next layer explains why this trend is not temporary. It is part of a larger shift in how the economy is structured, and that shift extends far beyond technology itself, into how value is created and captured everywhere. The third layer is where technology stops being a product and becomes a system, because what you are paying for is no longer just functionality. It is access to a constantly evolving digital environment. And that environment is designed to keep expanding over time. New features are added, but they rarely replace old costs. Instead, they stack on top of existing layers of spending, so your total cost increases without a clear, single decision point. This is what makes the system feel gradual rather than expensive. Now look at how upgrades are positioned. They are framed as improvements, not replacements. So you are not fixing a problem. You are avoiding falling behind. And avoiding loss is psychologically stronger than seeking gain. This creates a subtle pressure to keep up continuously, not because you want more, but because you do not want less. Now add another force shaping this system. Technology is increasingly tied to identity and social participation. Your devices, apps, and platforms define how you connect and work. So opting out is not just inconvenient, it is socially costly. This makes demand less flexible than it appears. People continue paying because disengaging has hidden consequences. And that reduces price sensitivity across the entire system. Now consider how innovation is funded. New technologies require massive upfront investment and ongoing maintenance, especially in artificial intelligence and advanced computing infrastructure. These are not one-time costs. They scale with usage and demand. So growth itself increases cost rather than reducing it. This reverses the traditional expectation of technological deflation. Now, progress can make systems more expensive to sustain, and that cost must be distributed somewhere, which brings it back to the user over time. Now, here's the pattern connecting everything so far. Costs are becoming less visible, but more continuous, and continuity makes them harder to question or resist. Because there is no single moment where the cost feels excessive. It accumulates through time instead of appearing all at once. This is for companies, but not always for users. Now, because it reflects a broader shift in how modern economies operate, from ownership to access, from products to systems, and from one-time cost to continuous extraction. Understanding that shift changes how you interpret everything around you, not just technology, but pricing, services, and daily life. And that is where the final clarity comes in, because once you see the structure, the confusion starts to dissolve. And what felt random begins to look systematic, which is exactly what we bring together in the final section, where the answer becomes less about price and more about how the system is designed to work. By now, the question is no longer why technology feels more expensive. It becomes clearer that the system itself has fundamentally changed. Technology did not stop becoming more efficient or powerful over time. But efficiency is no longer passed directly to users as lower prices. Instead, it is absorbed into larger, more complex systems. Systems that require constant funding, expansion, and maintenance. So cost does not disappear. It simply changes form, from visible purchases into ongoing, less noticeable commitments. This is why it feels like you are paying more over time, even if each individual payment seems small or justified. Now step back and look at the larger pattern. This is not just about technology becoming more expensive. It is about how modern economies extract value differently, less through large transactions and more through continuous participation. Participation that feels normal, necessary, and difficult to avoid. So the system does not need to increase prices dramatically. It only needs to extend how long you remain inside it. And that is where total cost quietly expands over time. Now here is the part that usually brings relief. If technology feels harder to manage financially, you are not mistaken. The system has shifted from ownership toward continuous dependency. And that shift changes how cost is experienced. It becomes less visible, but more persistent. So confusion is not failure. It is a response to structural change. Now the advantage comes from seeing that structure clearly, not to avoid it completely, but to interact with it differently. Because once you recognize continuous costs, you start noticing patterns, which ones are necessary, and which ones quietly accumulate without value. That awareness alone changes how you engage with technology, not emotionally, but more deliberately over time. And that is where control begins to return, gradually, not by rejecting progress, but by understanding its cost structure. If this helped you make sense of something that felt unclear before, stay here. There is always another layer behind how systems shape your financial reality. And most of those layers are not immediately visible. So take a moment and reflect on your own digital habits. Where are you paying continuously without fully noticing the total cost? That is where your next insight is already waiting. Not in cutting everything, but in seeing more clearly. Because clarity is what turns invisible systems into visible choices. And visible choices are where real control begins. Slowly, quietly, but more sustainably over time. You are not behind, and you are not doing it wrong. You are simply seeing a system that was designed to feel effortless. And that awareness is already changing how you move within it. Not dramatically, but in ways that compound over time, which is exactly how long-term financial control is built. Not by avoiding systems, but by understanding their structure, and using that understanding to make quieter, better decisions. That is where clarity turns into actual advantage.